What will you do if you woke up tomorrow morning and realized you had lost a week of your life? And it wasn't because of a really bad hangover or a coma, but because the authorities have decided that the calendar was going to be changed. As weird as that sounds, that's what some Europeans woke up to on the morning of 15 October 1582. And this wasn't just a Prussian question of searching for lost time. There were practical implications to this as well, such as collecting your paycheck or paying rent for the month. And this fact that it was the Pope taking away days of one's life didn't help matters at all. The calendar, as we understand, it is a human invention meant to track the changing seasons. But what happens when that calendar becomes misaligned, so to speak? The question of whether or not that really matters came to a head in the 16th century due to how Christians calculated the date of Easter. As a result, timekeeping as we know it experienced a fundamental change. The Gregorian calendar as it's known and used today gets its name from Pope Gregory XIII, who oversaw its creation and installment in 1582. But the road to the implementation of the Gregorian calendar was a rocky one and meant that time had to be sacrificed one way or another. Prior to the installment of the Gregorian calendar, there existed what was known as the Julian calendar. In 46 BC, Julius Caesar instituted a new calendar which became known as the Julian calendar. In an attempt to realign the calendar with the spring equinox and the solar year, the Julian calendar had 365 days with an extra leap year day added every 4 years and was closer to the solar calendar's length of 365.2422 days. But in order to introduce the new calendar, Caesar added 3 months into the current year to bring the Roman Empire's calendar in line with the current solar calendar. As a result, 46 BC became the longest year ever with a total of 445 days in the calendar. Kings in the new Julian calendar were relatively resolved by AD 12 writings of the conversion. But although the Julian calendar had less of a drift than the previous used Roman calendar, it was still about 11 minutes and 14 seconds longer than a solar or tropical year. This meant that the calendar still drifted with respect to the spring equinox and the tropical calendar. According to Scientific American, the Julian calendar was used for almost 16 centuries before this slight discrepancy became an actionable issue for the Catholic Church. By 1582, the discrepancy that had started as a mere 11 minutes had gone to 11 days. And because the Catholic Church used the spring equinox to calculate the date for Easter, this meant that the drift could push Easter further and further into the calendar year. Although it might not seem like a big deal today, for early Christians, the date of the spring equinox was extremely important, especially for calculating the date for Easter celebrations. In the Christian Experience, a book written by Michael Molloy, writes that out of all the Christian festivals, Easter was the first and the most important one. And not only was the spring equinox essential in calculating the date for Easter, but the date of Easter was necessary to have in order to calculate the date of both Lent and Pentecost. The method by which early Christians calculated Easter was decided by the First Council of Nicaea in AD 325 and established that Easter was celebrated on the first Sunday following the first full moon after spring equinox. But because the Julian calendar was slowly shifting the calendar date of the equinox compared to the tropical equinox, it meant that the date of Easter was also shifting with respect to the solar spring equinox. Although the Catholics didn't do anything about the discrepancy until the 16th century, it was noticed and remarked upon by many people well before then. According to a book titled A Brief History of Timekeeping by Chad Ozel, in 1267, the Julian calendar was described as intolerable, horrible, and laughable by Roger Bacon, an English monk, for its inconsistency with the solar calendar. One of the early papal attempts to reform the calendar was by Pope Sixtus IV in 1475, but the person he chose to help devise the reforms, astronomer and mathematician Johannes Müller von Königsberg, also known as Reggio Montanus, died after arriving in Rome to work on the calendar, and the project was abandoned. In 1572, Cardinal priest Ugo Boncompagni became Pope Gregory XIII. Soon after becoming Pope, he decided to address the matter of the drifting calendar, having previously worked on the issue with the Council of Trent from 1545 to 1563. A commission was formed to create a new calendar, composed of a variety of people including members of both the Roman and the Eastern churches, a lawyer, a historian, an astronomer, and a mathematician. Together, the commission tried to come up with a calendar that appropriately took into consideration the fact that civil years necessarily consist of integral days, as Jesuit astronomer Christophe Clavius stated by Scientific American. In other words, you could not fix the calendar by just tacking on a partial day at the end. After the commission submitted their final report in 1581, Pope Gregory XIII prepared to announce the new calendar. The calendrical reforms of Inter Gravissimas, the papal bull that introduced the Gregorian calendar, were largely the suggestion of Aloysius Lelius, popularly known as Luigi Lelio, an Italian physician and astronomer. In a book titled The Calendar by David Erwin Duncan, writes that the commission initially struggled with how to determine the exact length of a solar year. Not only did the current length of the year differ from the length recorded by Ptolemy, but there was also the growing debate between Ptolemaic and Copernican thoughts. Lelius decided to bypass this by simply basing his estimate on the popular Aphocenes tables, astronomical tables from 1252 that were based in Ptolemaic theories and used for calculating the position of the planets. And once the length of a solar year was established, it was simply a matter of figuring out how to realign the two calendars. There were a couple of ideas considered as to how to get the calendars back in sync, ranging from dropping a day roughly every 134 years to skipping 10 leap years over the course of 40 years. But ultimately, it was decided to do it all in one fell swoop. Unfortunately, the exact reason behind this decision are unknown due to Lelius' submitted manuscripts being lost. But despite the science behind the calendar reform, Pope Gregory XIII's introduction of it became a political document, because Gregory was taking up the actions of the Council of Trent, a counter-reformation council. The reform was seen as illegitimate in the eyes of Orthodox Christians due to references to the council in the papal bull. The Gregorian calendar that the commission had come up with followed some of the ideas of the Council of Nicaea, while also making contemporary political compromises. Because of this, the date for the spring equinox was set to March 21st, where it continues to be to this day. In order to realign March 21st with the solar spring equinox, the Commission decided to take 10 days off the year in 1582. The papal bull Inter Gravissimas announced in February 1582 that the year was going to have a 10-day shift in the calendar in order to realign the date of spring equinoxes with the solar calendar. It was decided by the Commission that the 10-day shift should happen in October, moving from October 4 directly to October 15, because it did not conflict with any important feast or major saint days during that time. With this jump, the calendars would be realigned and the new rules of the Gregorian calendar, having been decided by the Commission, would be implemented. A man whose brother had been on the Commission, Antonio Lelius, was given the exclusive contract for publishing the new calendars with the Gregorian system, but he was unable to fulfill the large number of orders for new calendars, and by September 1582, the publishing contract was given to someone else. Now let us look at the differences between the Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendar. At first glance, there is little difference between the Julian and the Gregorian calendars, which both include 365 days with occasional leap years, adding one day to the year. But the method by which the Gregorian calendar addressed the issue of aligning the calendar year with the tropical year was slightly more complex and more precise than that of the Julian calendar. Secondly, the Julian calendar introduced the concept of leap years, adding a day to the calendar. But because the Julian calendar added an extra day every 4 years, it made a calendar year 365.25 days longer, roughly 0.0078 solar days longer than a solar year. While Alolese Leliusa system from the Gregorian calendar also followed the concept of adding another day with a leap year every 4 years. Eleusas decided to drop the extra day if the leap year date was a century year that was thought divisible by 400. Additionally, the ecclesiastical calendar or the Catholic lunar calendar was also reformed by Leleusa in order to keep the date of Easter consistent with the lunar calendar. This involved a series of rules for shortening days or dropping them altogether, but because they are set on 2,500-year-old cycle, some of the rules have yet to be used. The transition of this calendar met public responses, some of which include first, when the calendars officially skipped from October 4 to October 15, 1582, not everyone was ready to accept the transition smoothly. Effectively, people had lost 10 days of their lives, and it wasn't quite clear what was going to happen with those 10 days. Projects were suddenly due 10 days sooner. But what about the wages that were to be collected during those days? There was also the issue of how to pay a month's rent or collect interest. Others expressed concern that the saints that had their days skipped over might be upset by this change, and the fact that not all religions across Europe adopted this change likely didn't help the situation. It's not easy to take days off of one's life when there is the knowledge that the 10 days are still there across the border or even in the next town over. Anti-Gregorian astronomer Michael Mislin even scared people by claiming that the Pope had literally stolen 10 days off of everyone's lives. According to a book titled Thomas Harriot, written by Robin Arianrod, there was enough of a public backlash against the potential loss of 10 days that it persuaded Queen Elizabeth I of England, who was practically a Protestant, not to accept the reforms coming from the Catholic, even though the new Gregorian calendar was more accurate with regards to the solar calendar, and the fact that it was the Pope who was imposing the reform didn't help sell the idea on the continent experiencing waves of Protestantism. Public response eventually led to protesting of the new calendar, as European countries embraced Protestantism throughout the 16th century and moved away from seeing the Pope as an authority who could command no religious aspect of people's lives. The idea of having the Pope dictate something like the calendar seems like a great violation. In places like Frankfurt, Germany, people protested both the Pope and the mathematician who had helped reform the calendar for supposedly conspiring to steal people's wages. And James Hilbrand, a theological professor in Tübingen, Germany, called Pope Gregory XIII a calendar maker and the Roman Antichrist. Some countries like the United Kingdom did not make the switch to the Gregorian calendar for almost 2 full centuries. Parts of Germany varied in when they accepted the Gregorian calendar, and some regions actively resisted reforming their calendar for decades. Other countries like Belgium and the Catholic states of the Netherlands did not make the switch until the end of the year, which meant that their calendars jumped from December 21st, 1582 to January 1st, 1583, which meant a year without Christmas. Most Protestant countries ended up adopting the calendar reform, but did so without referencing the Pope in any way in their announcements. Among Protestants, one of the prevailing ideas agreed with Martin Luther's sentiments that religious authority should not be in charge of timekeeping for a society. Others among both Protestants and Catholics believed that the Julian calendar was created by God, ironically, a position that the Church itself had taken for centuries. France, Italy, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Portugal, and Spain were some of the first countries to incorporate the new calendar reform into their timekeeping, as those countries were all heavily Catholic at that time. In both Protestant and Eastern Orthodox countries, the Gregorian calendar reform wasn't implemented at first and would take years to be introduced. As a result, some protests against the calendar came centuries later, when countries finally made their respective shifts. In 1752, when Britain made the switch from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar and lost 11 days, people protested in what became known as the Calendar Riots. By the 1700s, countries like Germany and Denmark finally started making the Gregorian changes to their calendar, but they did their own calculations for Easter, creating a Protestant Easter calendar. As a result, years like 1724 and 1744 ended up having two dates for Easter celebration depending on which calendar was used. Germany would not fully switch to the Gregorian calendar until 1775, when Frederick the Great outlawed the Protestant Easter calendar. And in places like Sweden, the German Protestant Easter calendar was adopted, but instead of dropping 10 days, they dropped only one, leading to a new calendar entirely in 1700. According to essays on astronomical history and heritage, Sweden's King Charles XII introduced a plan that involved deleting 11 leap days starting in 1700. This would align the Swedish calendar with the Gregorian calendar by 1740. A little over a decade later, Sweden switched back to the Julian calendar following the decree sent by the exiled Charles XII from the Ottoman Empire. In 1753, Sweden adopted the Gregorian calendar and made the necessary realignment by going from February 17 to March 1st. However, Sweden also used a different calendar for Easter and celebrated Easter on different day from the rest of Europe until 1844, over 4 centuries of conversion. Overall, it took almost 400 years for the Gregorian calendar to be adopted fully across Europe. Russia was one of the last countries to make the switch in 1918 after the Bolshevik Revolution, and this is why the Russian October Bolshevik Revolution is called as such, despite now being dictated as occurring in November. During the adoption of the reform in the British colonies in North America in 1752, writers like Benjamin Franklin reassured his readers that the loss of time was nothing to lament, and to consider what an indulgence is here for those who love their pillow to lie down in peace on the 2nd of this month and not perhaps awake till the morning of the 14th. And the shift to the Gregorian calendar wasn't localized only to Europe. In South America, Spain and Portugal imposed a calendrical reform on their colonies in the 16th century. Across Africa, traditional calendars were typically kept until they were forcibly discouraged by the respective European colonial authorities. Meanwhile, in Asia, the Meiji Emperor introduced the Gregorian calendar to Japan in 1873, and in China, the Communist Party adopted the Gregorian calendar on October 1st, 1949. In many places, it was neither a calendrical nor a religious desire to change calendars that led to the eventual shift, but the fact that it was comparatively difficult to conduct international trade with two different calendar dates. Please note, the list above only includes countries that officially used the Julian calendar before the Gregorian calendar was introduced. Countries that switched from a different calendar system to the Gregorian calendar, such as Saudi Arabia in 2016, are excluded. In some cases, it shows a simplified version of events. Each country is listed by its current name, although its official name may have changed since the calendar reform. Having looked at the historical analysis, it is now informative to understand that in October of 1582, the world went to sleep expecting tomorrow, but tomorrow never came. One night, people closed their eyes on October 4th, and when they woke, it was October 15th. No disaster, no eclipse, no divine warning in the sky, just 10 days erased from history. For farmers, wages vanished. For the faithful, feast days disappeared. For ordinary people, time itself became something that could be changed by human decision. The calendar was corrected, the clocks moved forward, and life continued. But something fundamental had shifted. Time was no longer untouchable, it was measured, adjusted, rewritten. And ever since that moment, we have lived by a system that reminds us of a quiet truth. History is not only shaped by wars and kings, but by the invisible rules that govern our days. 10 days were lost in 1582, but their echo still remains. Because if time can disappear once, who is to say it could not happen again? This is Echoes of Time TV, where history never truly fades. Thank you for listening. Catch you on the next episode.